Though not exactly knife point horror, I thought listeners might like this very loose, semi-improvised trilogy of scary stories, which were recorded just as a little thank you to all the people who have written to me about the podcast. Hope you like them. I'm a writer by trade, a struggling one, but a writer, and sometimes when the writer's block comes, the only thing I know to do to really fix it is to go camping, completely isolate myself, and just hack through it out of my tent, do some hiking, clear my head. I had one of these little adventures just 2 months ago. What I did was took the weekend and I drove down Skyline Drive in Northern Virginia into Shenandoah National Park, just basically with my fairly nice one-man tent, intending to stay Saturday and Sunday. I like to be as far away from people as possible, but still and have some sort of contact. So I always take my fully charged cell phone. And on this weekend, I drove down and I stopped at one of the ranger stations to get a backwoods map. As I was talking to the ranger a little bit, a friend of his was there in the little shack with him, and he was kind of obsessed with something on his phone. And I asked him what was going on, and he said there had been a murder. A body had been found just 8 miles south of the park in a little town called Slumber, which I'd actually come through to get gas. He said it was especially grisly. He was talking about they had found a decapitated body. He seemed kind of darkly excited in a way that this horrible thing had happened so close. Anyway, I got my backwoods map and I left that place and I drove about another 4 miles down the road until it went from a single lane to becoming unpaved to becoming not a whole lot more than just a double line of tire ruts, very grassy and overgrown. And at some point I turned off, went about 100 yards into the woods, over the grass, to a place that wasn't quite an official backwoods site, but it was close enough. Very grassy and lots of trees around, very isolated. So as dark fell, I pitched my little tent, took my laptop and all my laptop batteries out of the back seat. I had plenty of juice, and made myself a little dinner, made myself a little fire, and then I went into my tent. Looking at my map there in the tent by the lantern light, I saw that I was fairly close to a little area called Gargoyle Bend. It's a kind of a strange formation of rocks that look like faces, huge, enormous rocks, taller than I am. And I decided that the next day I would go down there just for a hike, maybe an hour or two. I would walk around just to sort out details of a new story I was working on. I slept that night a little bit strange. I kind of went in and out of consciousness. I thought I was dreaming about this claws. I kept just these vague mental images of claws, and specifically the sound claws might make against a metal surface. I'm not sure what it was, but it was just a scratching sound that kept coming to me, and sometimes I was awake, sometimes I was asleep. I was just kind of groggy in general, a little bit cold there, didn't bring much protection, and I woke up at dawn and not terribly refreshed, but good enough to do a little bit of writing in the morning and then take a walk. The problem was that I realized I had left a little canvas bag with my original story notes back at the gas station in slumber where I had stopped for gas. It came to me, basically what I do is I make a lot of handwritten notes and I transcribe them. Well, in this case, my original handwritten notes, I realized I had left them stupidly on top of the toilet tank back in the men's room at this little dingy, ancient gas station in Slumber, Virginia. And my first instinct was to get on the iPhone, and call the station and ask them, could you please hold it for me? Maybe I'll be back, swing by there today and get those. But I stopped in the middle of calling. And this is kind of the ridiculous part of the story. I had left the gas station without paying for a map. Basically what happened is when I pulled in, I was pumping my gas, and the station attendant had come out. Very strange man. We had exchanged a couple of words. I'd asked him where the bathroom was. When I came back from there, he was simply gone. He was not inside the little office. He wasn't anywhere, and I had this map of Virginia, like an old-fashioned road map, with me, and I just waited for him to come back, and 5 and 10 minutes went by. He just did not come back. I got so frustrated that I left a 20 on the fly-specked counter inside the little office area, which actually wasn't quite enough to pay for the gas, and I just took the map with me. I was just resentful that he would just disappear or leave me waiting like that. So in the middle of calling the station to ask if he could maybe go in and into the men's room and see if my notes were there, I stopped because I technically left without paying. I just didn't want to get into it at that time, so I didn't complete the call. I was in my tent for about an hour, and at about 10 a.m. I started to hear the first raindrops. I knew there was a pretty good chance of rain, but I didn't know it was going to start so early. I looked out, and I still vowed to go for a walk, but I was going to have to get my good rain gear out of the trunk. I went around to the back of the trunk, and I got out my key ring, and I looked for it, and I was looking for the trunk key, and it wasn't on my key ring. More great news, I thought at the time. Honestly, I could not remember the last time I had been inside my trunk for anything. I gave up fairly quickly trying to remember where I had left my trunk key. All that was in there was a hydraulic jack and a spare tire, my old rain gear, such as it was. So the day was shaping up great. I had lost my notes, didn't know where my trunk key was, and it was raining. Still, though, I went. I walked down toward Gargoyle Bend. It took me about a half an hour to get there. Looked at the strange rocks, took a couple of pictures, and went for a little informal hike. And I finally got a little bit tired, sat down, ate a couple of granola bars, and then went back to my tent. I didn't come out of there. I was writing on the laptop until dark. As I started to make the fire, it had stopped raining, thank goodness. The firelight, such as it was, kind of shone on my car, which is only about 8 feet away from the side of the fire, and I saw something was up with the trunk. I knew there had been a dent in the trunk. I figured something might have fallen onto it from a tree, just a very minor dent, but as the light of the fire threw the light into a new angle, I saw that the dent in the trunk was kind of pushing from the inside out, if that didn't make any sense, as if maybe I had closed the trunk on something. It was just one dent. I supposed it was possible. I just didn't remember closing the trunk very hard on something. I knew the jack was in there. But I would have thought I would have noticed that, so I just kind of looked at that dent for a while. Saturday night, I ate a cold dinner, and I went to bed pretty early, maybe 9 o'clock. I was tired of writing. Nothing was really working too well. I thought I might want to stay out for an extra day there in the woods. I didn't sleep very well, and I came awake very late, something woke me up, some sound, but it had just been on the edge of my consciousness, whether it was a banging or something hitting something else, maybe even a gunshot in the distance. I came awake just too late to know what it was that had roused me. I lay there in the sleeping bag waiting for it to come back, but it didn't. The light of my fire was still very low, and it was casting a little tiny orange glow on the back of the car. I could see it through the tent flap. I lay there for a while listening to the things scuttling in the leaves around me, the wildlife, listening to the wind, and thinking about that dent in the trunk. And I was thinking about my 20 minutes or so at the gas station back in slumber the day before. The gas station, I can't even describe how ancient it was. It's one of those, you can't believe it's really open, just the one pump. But I had pulled into it because I was pretty desperate. I really wanted a map and I desperately needed gas. I remember I'd gotten out and I'd started pumping my gas, and out came from the office this man in overalls. Looked a little bit strange. He was maybe 50 years old. His hair was thinning, but very unevenly. Little patches of it were just missing, and he smiled at me very strangely. Remember, when I asked him where the bathroom was, I think I had to ask him a couple of times. It was almost as if he didn't know where it was, and had to remind himself. Maybe he was mentally slow or something. I was going to just leave the gas pumping and pay him when I got back, but he started asking me a couple of questions, where I was from, and very specifically where I was headed, what I was doing. He kind of slurred his speech a little. He spoke in a mumble. And the strangest part was, I swear, maybe I misheard him. After I told him where I was going and for how long, and commented on the weather, he looked at me with kind of a weird half smile, and I think he said, "Gonna be a good time to put on the makeup." And even at the time when he said that, I thought I must have misheard, but I just wasn't interested. And I kind of stopped pumping gas and I walked off toward the men's room, intending to go into the office and pay him afterwards. But when I came out a few minutes later, he was gone. He was not in the office. We were right beside the highway. He couldn't have gone anywhere. I actually walked around the back of the building. There was no garage bay, no nothing. Maybe he'd gone into a little house. Maybe he lived in the house that was just behind it, a little bit up the road. I thought maybe he'd gone there, but why? It was too long for me to walk over there, so I just left the money on the counter and I took that map and I drove off, thinking how strange this man was at the gas station. And now as I lay there in my tent, I was thinking about him again. Slumber, Virginia. It was about 4:15. I wanted to do a little sky gazing, so I got up cold, left the tent, kicked at the embers of the fire a little to get it going again, and I walked off a ways into the woods so I could check out the unblemished sky. I guess I was just far enough from my campsite. I couldn't really see anything if I turned and looked through the woods. All I could see was the glow of the campfire. And still thinking about the incident at the gas station, I decided to turn on my phone and call it. I actually had to do a little bit of a search for it. I could get a pretty good signal out there in the dark and in the wilderness of the Virginia woods. And I located the number and I dialed it. And as I dialed it, I stood there in the dark looking off in the distance at the little glow of my campfire. And there were several rings. I don't know what I was expecting. It was ridiculous. I just felt like I had to call. Because I knew I had seen my trunk key on the ring when I'd gotten out of my car to pump gas. I just knew it somehow. This realization sunk into me like a little knife made of ice. But of course, 9, 10 rings, and there was no answer. It was not even dawn. Ridiculous. And I walked back through the woods, and when I got to the campfire, I immediately saw that the trunk of my car was open. Not by a few inches or so, it was wide open as if someone had completely opened it up. I froze, looking at it, about 10 feet away. The light of the fire was too dim. I could not see inside, and I could not see inside my car. I looked down, and my hydraulic jack that I always kept in the trunk was on the ground. I didn't know. I stared at it. And stared at it, and I looked, trying to see inside the trunk. I couldn't see anything. It was too dark. I looked at it, and I looked, trying to see inside the trunk, but I couldn't. Trying to see inside my car through the back window, and I couldn't. Very slowly I backed away from the car and the campfire. I turned and looked into the woods. It was completely dark. I didn't know whether to run into them or try to get in the car. I didn't know where the person who had made this happen was. In the end, it was the woods that I went to. I backed away, looking over my shoulder, and I got into them about 15 feet or so, looking for any sign of movement near the car, and there wasn't. And then I did begin to run through the woods. I ran in the general direction of Gargoyle Bend. And I ran until I was out of wind. And when I got to Gargoyle Bend, I could see the stones in the dark rising up, and I could hear the trickle of a river, and I could hear a stream nearby, and I felt almost unfamiliar ground, even though it was so dark. I leaned against one of the stones, and I called the police. And they picked up instantly, and what I told them was that I was deep in the woods, and I felt that someone was trying to threaten me. And then I asked them if there had been a murder in the town of Slumber, if that was true, and they said yes. And I said, by any chance, was it the owner of a gas station, have something to do with a gas station? And they said yes. And I said, I can't explain it, but I think the man who committed that murder is here in the woods, and I'm hiding from him right now. I was able to tell them, speaking as softly as I could in general, where I was, and then I stood against one of the rocks in Gargoyle Bend, my night vision slowly getting better, and I looked in the direction of where my campfire was, although of course now I was far away from it, and I just stood and I waited, trying to breathe very softly. At one point I kind of wedged myself in between two of the other tall standing rocks, because it felt safer to press my body in between them and slowly lower myself toward the ground, crouching there deep in the woods. And 5 minutes went by. My heart was just beating out of control. It wouldn't stop. Then I think maybe 10 minutes. And I should have heard sirens. I should have heard a car engine, or should have seen flashlights by then. They should have called the ranger station. The rangers should have been where I was just a few minutes. But there was no one. And then as I crouched there, I heard something. I heard leaves being crushed by footsteps. It was the only sound. And it got a little bit closer. And it got a little bit closer, and I slowly rose to a full standing height. And as I rose, my hand went out to the ground, and I clasped around a big, thick rock that just seemed perfect for my hand. It seemed like I was meant to hold it somehow, and I held it beside me. And I waited. And then I saw the shape of a man. It was his footsteps. He was about 15 feet in front of me, walking toward me, and he stopped because he had seen me. I couldn't see almost any details of his face. It was just too dark. I heard his voice, and immediately it was clear that it was the same voice I had heard back at the gas station. And this man was saying, "Hello, I'm having trouble with my car back at my campsite. Can you help me?" And for a moment I didn't answer. But then I told him, "Sure, I'm just out hiking. Why don't I call someone for you?" And I held up my cell phone in my other hand, the one that wasn't holding the rock. And I tapped it so the light would come on, and that he would see that I could call anyone. I could call the police right that second if I wanted to. And he said, "No, never mind. I was just hoping you would help me." And to this I said, "Nothing." And there was a pause, us just standing there. And then the tone of his voice changed just a little bit. And I heard leaves crunch as he moved just one step closer and stopped. And he said, "I bet that's your car, isn't it?" And a jolt of adrenaline went through my body at that moment. And then I committed to action. I took one step forward and I raised my right hand, the one with the rock in it. And I let out a cry, and I threw that rock as hard as I could right toward the man's face, and I heard it strike right between his eyes. It was this sickening, wet thud, and I heard his breath expel from his chest, and he went down, backwards like a shot. Like a shot, and he hit the ground, and I heard the leaves crunch, and I tore past him right at that moment. Went by him in the direction of my campfire. There was still trail enough where I could just keep running all the way back. My night vision was good enough where I could see where I was going, and I ran, and I got to my campfire after about 5 minutes. Totally exhausted, but I had my keys. And I ran forward and I slammed the trunk of the car downward, and I could see then these massive dents coming from inside where he had just somehow wrenched the hydraulic jack underneath from within the trunk where he had been hiding all along. I got on the front of the car, I turned on the engine, and I peeled out and I got quickly back onto the little dirt road that had led me there. I did not go at high speed. I drove at about 15 miles per hour because I didn't want to skid and go off the path into a tree. It was very tight maneuvering, even though I had four-wheel drive. I just kept the high beams on. And I rolled ever forward, looking for any sign of movement. I went about a half a mile, and by my calculations, Gargoyle Bend and the stream should have only been about 200 feet to my right. And I waited. I fully expected him to appear, to jump out in front of the car, staggering with his face bloodied. I slowly turned my head to the right to look deeper into the woods. I couldn't see anything, but I did realize that my passenger side door was completely unlocked. I reached over and I slammed the lock down and I kept going. A little bit faster, a little bit faster. And then is when I finally saw headlights coming the other way. It was the Ranger. Yet then came perhaps the darkest time of all. It was the time that they don't show you in the movies. It's right after help comes and it arrives, and you're waiting, and you just have a terrible feeling that it's not quite over. After I told the Ranger what was happening, he urged me to get inside his truck and lock the door, and I would wait in the back seat for him. And I did, and he let the engine run, and he stood out there in the glow of his own headlights, talking into a walkie-talkie, looking into the woods, just standing there, calm as could be, waiting, and I wanted to yell at him, "Let's get out of here, let's get out of here, you're not safe." He seemed so in control, and the sound of that engine running was like the clock ticking. I was just waiting for something awful to happen. We were not safe. I wanted to scream it out, but I held my tongue, just praying nothing would come out of the woods. And in the end, I got lucky. Of course, I spent the next day with the police. They went into the woods to find that man. He had been killed almost instantly by that rock throw. His face had been mashed and bloodied beyond recognition, and I had shattered his skull with that one throw. Some divine providence had saved my life and taken his. So there were a lot of questions, but finally I managed to start to put it behind me. That was 2 months ago. The one thing I wish they had never told me, but maybe there was no way around me ever finding out. One of the detectives was talking to me about finding the body. And it came out that the man had been holding something in his right hand when he stood there talking to me, baiting me there in the woods, getting ready to kill me, but it wasn't a weapon. As he stood there in the dark, right before I had thrown that rock, he had been holding in his right hand the head of the gas station owner, the head of the man he had randomly decapitated. He'd had it all along there in the trunk with him, and he'd carried it with him into the woods when he went to find me. My last name is Forsz, F-O-R-Z, and people ask me about my nationality sometimes. I tell them I'm Romanian-Hungarian. Several years ago, I became very interested in the history of my family, went through a phase, and I actually hired a genealogist to help me track down my family history. Went back about 200 years. The person I was most interested in was my great-great-grandfather Asher, simply because I had the most information about him. He lived in Romania all his life. He was just a carpenter. He'd never left Europe, never seen America. And with the help of the genealogist and a cousin of mine in Lancashire, England, who I visited, specifically for the purpose of finding more out about the family, I tracked down my great-great-grandfather's old books and papers, what few survived, in an old storage facility where we were keeping a lot of family heirlooms for posterity. And going through these old papers, I came across his diary, which he kept from the age of 39 until he was about 42, and then it simply ended. It was written in Hungarian, and my Hungarian is incredibly thin. But I managed to get through the diary, and about two-thirds of the way through it I came across about 25 pages, which absolutely stunned me. And it's the contents of those pages which I want to relate. I have the diary here in front of me. I'm going to piece through and try to interpret the Hungarian as best I can. It'll come out broken and fractured, but I don't want to translate it. I just want to read it once out loud. And this takes place, it's not dated, but from context I can tell it took place, these events, around the year 1893. And it begins like this. We met at the southern end of the Burgau. For Hardish and I, it was just a one-day journey by horseback. But for the policeman Clemendrada, it was another day by train from Bistritz. I consider Hardish to be one of the bravest men I've ever known, a true war hero, and it saddens me that most people will never know the depths of his courage. I do not know this Clemendrada at all, this policeman. I believe his motivations on this night are due mostly to the cache of silver he expects to recover from the castle. He says he does not believe in old wives' tales. He's very obese and quite profane. Okay, there's a gap here in the diary. The rest of Asherle's account was written after the night he speaks of was over. We met at the inn and wasted too much time planning, and with Clemendrada haggling over the price of the carriage, which had suddenly risen. We had agreed that we would tell people we were surveyors. Hardish was very edgy from the beginning, even more so than myself, although it was I who had the most rage in me. We eventually settled the price of the carriage and went off. I carried a single stake in my bag. Hardish had a stake and a pistol and a very long iron bar. The policeman Clemendrada had 2 pistols, and that was enough for him. I was also carrying along as many matches as I could. It was very important that I protect them. The weather was very, very cold. It had already begun to snow, and we weren't certain how this would affect our journey. It was an hour and a half until we came to Tadich Stor. It was only about 8 o'clock at that time, but in the village there was not a single light to be seen anywhere as we went through in the carriage. Clemendrada asked Hardish, when he thought I could not hear him, which house belonged to my wife's sister. And Hardish pointed it out. It was just one of the smallest houses in the village, now very dark. I knew, and maybe the policeman did not know, that Tadich Stor was always like this, even before Isa had been abducted. She was just 21. Clemendrada was stunned that no one walked down the road, and not even the pub was open for business, as if everyone was in hiding. Of course, that's exactly the case in Tadich Stor, cursed by geography. The snow continued to fall, but it didn't seem like it was going to be a real problem. We rode on past that point for another half an hour, not speaking much. Once in a while Clemendrada would say something, ask about the area, which was very foreign to him, and Hardish answered those questions. I could say little or nothing. The pass narrowed at one point, as we knew that it would. We had been there before, but it had been quite a while. Hardish had the horses going at a solid trotting speed, when suddenly he cried out, and got them to stop very quickly. We couldn't see very well. There were woods on both sides of us. It was quite dark. Clouds in the sky blocking the stars. When I got out of the carriage, I saw what Hardish did, which was that an enormous pit had been cut out of the pass. A pit about 10 meters across and as much as 2 meters deep in some places. Dug out, messily, blocking the road. Had the horses not been urged to stop, they might have gone into it, and there would have been a terrible accident. We walked around and around the pit. It was obviously an intentional construction, not an accident of nature. We were trying to figure out how to get around it, when Hardish said to me, "What is that over there?" We could see through the gloom that there was a man sitting, almost lying, at the base of a nearby tree, and we could see that there was a shovel sitting next to him, leaning against that tree. I walked over to him. It was too dark to see his face. I asked him if it was he who had made this pit, and if so, why he had done it. It must have taken him hours and hours, if not days. But from this man there came no response, though his head did tilt upwards. I reached into my pocket and I pulled out one of my matches, and I struck it and held it up toward the man, hoping that the snow would not snuff it out. I saw him fully, and I was disgusted and horrified at his incredibly white, grayish pallor, the bones of his thin face pushing out grotesquely, and he gazed up at me with lifeless eyes. His mouth opened and closed as if to speak, but no sound came out. I saw that on the left side of his neck was a grouping of garish, very slowly healing wounds, spreading out several inches in every direction, as if he had been bitten by some animal not once or twice or 5 times, but methodically chewed at over the course of time. Hardish and Clemendrada had stepped beside me. Clemendrada poked at the man with his finger, demanding an answer. But it was obvious that we would not get one. We decided to unhitch the horses. I and Hardish would ride on one, Clemendrada would take the other, and we would simply move on. We had no choice. The carriage had to be left behind. Eventually we came to the river. We tied up the horses at the place we had arranged to, and our raft was indeed waiting for us, the one we had paid the gypsies for. It was fully prepared, though there wasn't much to prepare. We got on, untied it, and pushed off. The wind was getting higher, and the cold had sunk into our bones, but we were still dry. Hardish pushed us off, and the current took us from there, very slowly, eastward. There was nothing to do then but hunker down and wait. We looked up at the sky and said nothing. My matches were still dry inside my coat, close to my heart. It was a good hour and a half of drifting down the river. Woods on either side, the mountains seeming to come closer and closer. At one point, Clemendrada lifted an arm and pointed into the distance. We looked up and we saw the silhouette of the castle there. I could not take my eyes off it as we got closer and closer until the raft took us finally to our place of disembarkation. We tied it up again, and we started to make our way through the woods. Just a little ways up the bank, we went past the corpse of a horse, or a horse that had been bled dry. so much so that it had seemed to shrink. Under the moonlight it appeared quite white, almost hairless. There were punctures all over its body. We tried not to look at it too carefully. As we went, the castle grew bigger and bigger in our vision, and we used it as a guide, making our way through the trees, our feet crunching in the snow. It was only another mile until we emerged from the trees and were virtually on the castle grounds. We climbed a very steep hill, our breath coming in short spurts, beginning to pant from the effort. I looked straight up. The castle was right before us, reaching up into the sky. I made a great effort not to look up toward any of the windows, lest I see faces looking down at me. Instead, I concentrated on what was immediately in front of us. There was a wall that blocked off a courtyard. I pressed my hands against the stone, and I was amazed to feel how incredibly old and crumbling the castle truly was. It was in terrible, terrible condition. Mossy rot was growing everywhere over every stone. It felt like the entire edifice could come apart in my hands. Hardish spotted a hole up one of the walls and began to clamber up towards it. It was about 8 feet above our heads. When he reached the hole, he told us that he could see the courtyard, and he leapt down into it. We followed. Clemendrata went first, and I came after him. Then the grass below our feet had been replaced by stone. There were 2 very large doors, both bolted, built into the castle, where we stood. Hardish went up to the one closest to us, and bent to examine the lock. Clemendrata gave him the iron bar that he had been carrying. We all looked at each other and knew what had to be done. Hardish positioned it against the lock in just such a way that he hoped to break it with one swift motion of the iron bar. But we shrunk against the thought of the sound it would create. On some silent count, he went ahead and tried to shatter the lock. It did, in fact, come apart very easily, but the sound was like a shot in the silence. We stood for a time, looking up and around us, all 3 of us lost in the shadows of this enormous castle. We waited for some sound, some vision to emerge from the darkness. Hardish pushed that large door inwards, and it creaked loudly. He pushed his body through, and we followed. Then we were inside the castle. It was pure darkness. All 3 of us lit matches. It seemed that the air was so heavy that they would only last for bare seconds before fading and dying. We saw in front of us that there were 3 pathways, almost like fate. 3 ways to go, and 3 men. Clemendrata wished to go into the longest passage. He believed it would lead deeper into the castle, and upwards. Hardish and I allowed him to make his own decision. Hardish would go toward the right, where it was darkest, and no turns could be seen, and I would go to my left, toward a tunnel that seemed to slope downwards, which would have taken me below the earth. We all looked at each other one last time and decided to go our separate ways. They both disappeared quickly into the darkness. It was incredibly cold in the castle, those stones conducting the cold all through me. I didn't want to have to use any more of my matches than I had to, but it was simply too dark. So I lit them one by one, taking them out of my coat to guide my way. The tunnel that lay before me did in fact curve downward, moss under my feet, making my steps virtually silent. I had to bend over slightly as I made my way. The rock around me was ancient and crumbling. There were huge gaps in the walls at various points. I thought I could hear the scurrying of rats. I thought my eyes might adjust to the darkness somewhat, but it was very difficult going. I walked for about 5 minutes, gently descending underneath Castle Dracula. At some point I began to hear the trickle of water. As I kept going, the trickle got louder, until it was almost as if there were a stream running very nearby. I ducked into a very narrow passage and took a right turn. And the passage was very thin and filled with crumbled rock, as if there had been some sort of effort to break down another portion of the castle and put the leavings in here. As I went through this passageway, I saw, running against what I thought was a north wall of the castle, yes, it was a stream, a very thin, black stream, trickling by me. I stood for a time, watching it, wondering where it was coming from. And as I stood there watching it, something appeared in the water, moving along very slowly. I got closer to the stream, and I saw that it was pages, vellum, that had been torn from a very large book. 2 pieces, then 5 pieces, then 12, and then those pages were gone. Before the last one could get past me, I reached out and touched one of them and picked it up. The water was icy. I folded this piece of paper and I took it. Even now I'm not sure why I did that. The air in the castle seemed to be becoming heavier and heavier with each passing minute. I got my pocket watch out of my coat and I checked the time, and I was confused by what I saw. It told me that I had been in the castle already for 30 minutes, but that seemed impossible. I felt lightheaded and strangely warm inside my skin. It was as if the air was poisoning me, little by little. I was crouched down to reach into the stream, and now I stood up and decided to keep going, down ever further. At my rate of descent, I judged I was probably 40 or 50 feet below the earth. Another passageway curved, and then there was a dead end. I was in a large room and had more space to breathe, and I felt not so claustrophobic. I lit a new match and looked around me. There were objects here, lying against the walls. I saw that they were stone coffins, incredibly ancient. Most of them broken, pieces missing, various colors of rot streaking their surfaces. There were larger stones embedded in smaller ones in the walls, and these had markings on them in a language I didn't understand. I was surrounded by a ring of 8 or 9 coffins, lying vertically, resting against these stone walls as if some sort of rearrangement was underway, as if they were being moved from one place to another. I did not have the courage to investigate these coffins. They struck me as being so old that I was looking perhaps at the entombed mummies of ancient ancestors. There did not seem to be anywhere for me to go. I had reached a dead end. As I stood there, wondering what to do next, there finally came a sound of human presence. It was of running feet, very, very far in the distance, running feet on a stone surface, high, high above my head. The sound conducted through the castle's mysterious passageways. Running feet for about 5 or 10 seconds, and then it stopped. I stood for a time, waiting to see if they would come again, but they didn't. I had no way of knowing whose footsteps those were, or exactly how far away they were. I intended to move, to turn and head back, but I found myself powerless to move. My limbs felt so heavy, my brain in a fog. It was that air, that castle air, and some sort of evil mixture of age and corruption sinking into me. When I checked my pocket watch again, it told me that I had been inside Castle Dracula for 1 hour and 15 minutes. I felt my memory slipping. Finally, I shook myself out of this trance and began to walk back the way I came, hoping against hope that I remembered how to get back above ground. There were just a few turns, and the castle's passageways guided me back. The most difficult part was entering a narrow passageway where the ceiling suddenly became much lower to the ground, and I had to bend over halfway, hunched. I was running out of matches, and I felt I would go through it without the aid of any sort of light, but halfway through this passageway, I became very frightened, so I struck one. Looking ahead toward the end of it, on the mossy ground, I saw an object. It was a human hand, lying there. I believed it was severed. I had somehow walked right over it as I had gone deeper into the castle, deeper underground. And now I was really seeing it for the first time, a hand. I walked closer to it and knelt down. It was not a severed hand I was looking at. Instead, it was connected to some living being I could not see, and was simply protruding from the tiniest of holes in that mossy floor. Because the hand was alive. It had reached up through this hole and now lay dormant but slightly twitching, reaching through the hole as if it were waiting for something to pass by that it could seize. The fingernails were painted. It was of incredible age, so withered by years. Something compelled me to reach out to it. I touched it, just the tip of one of its fingers, and when I did so, it withdrew just an inch, but it did not retract into the hole. That was enough to send me onward, not looking downwards anymore. I went through that tunnel and I kept on my way, trying to remain focused. I tried to picture my wife's sister, her face. She was the reason I was here. I heard the trickle of that stream again, and I moved past it. And I felt myself moving back upwards, and I finally did come to that joining of 3 dark passageways. We had agreed to meet right here, but there was no one. It was just me. I listened for footsteps somewhere in the castle. I decided to go out through the door that we had entered. I pushed my way out and was struck by a blast of cold wind. It was still snowing. And I took a few steps out into that barren, cramped courtyard. I looked up at the rising wall of the castle, and I saw in the moonlight, from a window cut into the stone high, high above me, there was a rope dangling outwards. The rope reached down toward the ground. Tied to the rope, hanging, dangling upside down, was the policeman Clemendrada, motionless, his face pressed against the stone of the castle wall. More rope stretched from his wrist downward, tied to the leg of another man who was also dangling upside down, gently nudged by the wind, and this was Hardish. They were too high above me to see faces, but I could tell they were dead. They had been pushed out that window and left to hang. Instead of running away, I found myself turning very slowly, losing all hope and knowing that I was going to die on this night. A greater man than I would have been pushed toward greater vengeance, energized by this sight, but not me. I am weak, and I lost the last of my light at that moment. I knew I would never see my wife again. I climbed up the rock that we had scaled, and I went through the hole, and I dropped out on the other side into the grass. I was outside the castle, and I stumbled toward the woods very slowly, waiting for anything to come along and kill me, and put me out of my considerable misery. Step after step I crunched through the snow, through the woods just beyond Castle Dracula. Since nothing stopped me, I went on, not thinking about the sharp wooden stake I had in my pack, thinking only of those bodies tied up to dangle outside the castle, as a warning, as a sign, or simply out of convenience. The next thing I remember, I was on the raft. I untied it and lay down upon it. Without Hardish or Clemendrada, I had no chance to row upstream against the current. So when I pushed off, I merely drifted down it even further, not exactly certain what lay beyond. I lay on my back and looked up at the cloudy sky and cursed my life. The time passed as I went in and out of consciousness. It was shortly before dawn that I found the strength to sit up on the raft, drifting down it almost peacefully. I looked down the river and I saw that I was coming to an embankment, and that soon my progress would be stopped by this sandy bank. But it was not empty. There was someone standing knee-deep in the water as I drew closer to him. The tall silhouette of a man in some sort of cloak, just standing and waiting for me to come closer. And beside this man was another figure, a much smaller one, which struck me as feminine, though I couldn't quite see. Seeing these two figures frightened me so badly, I laid back down and closed my eyes and just waited. The minutes passed, and I finally felt the raft bump against the shore. Looking up, terror tore into me as I saw a figure standing above me. It was a woman, and as I rose to my feet to look at her, I saw it was Isa. She was alive. She was standing, shivering in the cold, looking up at me. She said my name. She seemed so pale and thin. I threw my arms around her and began to cry. And the last glimmer of sanity left me enough reason to pull back at one point and look at her neck. There were no markings there, no wounds. I was looking at her as she was. She was alive. After so many months, she was alive. I will not say in this diary how I came to return her to her home in Tadic Stor. I will only say that she has no memory of her time away from us, no memory of the night she was stolen. We are simply grateful for her return. The doctors examined her and found nothing wrong with her except for her emaciation and dehydration and a brain fever that had stolen her memory. Why Isa was returned to us, we will never know. My wife is grateful to me for what she considers heroism, but I'm sure I'll always live in shame for my inaction after I saw the bodies of Hardish and Clemendrada. I should have gone in to kill Dracula as I had meant to when the night began. That is where my great-great-grandfather's diary ends. It resumes again on completely unrelated matters about a month after that incident. There are just a few pages left in the diary, and it was continued after that, I'm sure, but I don't have anything more. The papers that I found do not continue. What I do have, I believe, although I cannot be sure, is the piece of vellum that he reached down and took from that strange cold stream running underneath Castle Dracula. It was found amongst his papers, and only because the handwriting on it and the style of paper is so different from anything else that we found of my great-great-grandfather's, do I assume that it's the piece of paper that he brought back with him from that night. Because it was soaked by that icy water, of course, the ink faded to almost nothing, but after some reconstruction I was able to read most of it. It was written in a flowing, archaic-looking script in Hungarian, and it's little more than a listing of the physical details of the land around that area, as if these details were being transcribed for some sort of real estate documentation purpose. Harmless, nothing strange. But when I think that the letters on this piece of paper may very well have been scrawled by that evil creature, it makes it all seem so real to me, more real somehow than if I had found my great-grandfather's wooden stake that he had taken with him. This piece of paper is something I have with me all the time now. Its very innocuousness somehow proving that every word written in this diary is true.
It was on a Monday when I sent letters to all my friends telling them about my plan. I'd set myself up for a full year of unemployment so I could finally give the Luddite life a try. Just for a year or so, just to clear my mind of the internet and usernames and passwords and cable TV and the 24/7 media cycle, even the car, all the traffic. I just found it all too exhausting, so I was going old school. I didn't even have a phone, effective immediately. I knew I'd probably cave as soon as I realized I wasn't getting any new followers on Twitter, but in the letter I wrote, I told everyone that for a while, I'd love to get a letter back from them where they should feel free to just come to my little house in the middle of nowhere anytime at all, because my door was always going to be unlocked. Figuratively speaking. It felt so good to put those letters in the mailbox and go back into the house and sit and just look at all the books I wanted to read and all the empty books I wanted to fill with my thoughts and my bad poems and my ignorant philosophies. I was happy. It had actually already been almost 2 weeks since I'd even ventured outside the house or turned on the TV. I felt ensconced. I felt safe. The very next night, something strange happened. I'd come awake in my bedroom. I wasn't even sure what time it was, because I'd gotten rid of my digital clock, along with almost everything else electronic. I knew it was really late. I was lying there awake listening to the drizzle outside, and there was a knock at my front door, which is always an unsettling sound so late when you're alone. I waited and I hoped it wouldn't repeat itself, but it did. So I got up and went to the door. I waited for the knock to come a third time, and through the door I asked who was there. I recognized the voice that responded. It was kind of a slurred and maybe drunken voice. It was an ex-girlfriend of mine, Sarah. It was a relief and also a profound irritation to hear her speak. She'd sort of disappeared off the face of the earth a few weeks before, and I'd had to fend off calls from her mother, who worried about her all the time, even though Sarah had done this before. She was an alcoholic and a maker of terrible choices. And now she was at my door just like in the old days, wanting to come in the middle of the night, some crisis having happened or something like that. And I told her through the door, I said, "No, Sarah, we were not going to go through this again. I wasn't going to open the door." So she pleaded her case. I forget what she said exactly, and I just held my ground. I wasn't going to get involved in this anymore. And then at one point there was a strange little pause, and I thought she was done speaking, and I could hear her say through the door, "It would be better if you were like us, Gary." And I asked her to repeat that, but she didn't. There was just silence outside. And I heard her footsteps leaving. And I figured, okay, that's the end of it. And I went back to bed. Now, a couple days later, I went outside for the first time in a while. And I went down the driveway to get my mail. And when I opened the box, I was confused because the letters that I had put in there to be delivered to my friends were still in there. I made sure the flag was up, and it just didn't make any sense. It had been a couple of days. I just left them there in the box. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure why they hadn't been picked up. On my way back to the front door, I happened to look down, and I saw 4 or 5 dime-sized drops of dried blood there on the cement. It was, dried and darkened, and I didn't know where they had come from. I didn't remember ever seeing them there, just 4 or 5 in a line. I bent down to examine them. I didn't know what to think. Later that afternoon, I was sitting and drinking coffee at my desk, and I had gotten up and I looked out the window for no particular reason. I looked up and down the road. I live on a very remote country road. I'm about 18 miles off I-81. There's only a couple of houses in each direction, and you really have to walk to see anything else. Right across from me, there's basically an empty field that's never been sold. And I saw a man sitting in that empty field. I'd never seen anything there. It was overgrown. And this man, he looked like he was trying to get to his feet from a sitting position and couldn't quite seem to. So I was a little worried. I thought he might be sick or hurt or something. He was wearing, it was not a fedora, whatever kind of style of hat men used to wear in the 30s and 40s. Other than that, he was just wearing a t-shirt and jeans and I think sandals. So he finally was able to get to his feet, and he stood there, and he slowly looked up at the sky, tilting his head, looking up at the dark clouds up there. And very, very slowly he began to raise his arms toward the sky. And it was that point I thought, well, this guy's not hurt. He's maybe crazy, he's homeless maybe. At one point, he kind of looked toward my house, and then I kind of moved away from the window and dropped the blinds. It was only about 10 seconds after I did that I heard the town siren go off, which only happens every couple of years. They just tested. I thought maybe it was time, so I stood there listening to it. And a few minutes later, when I looked out the window again, that man was gone. Just no sign of him. The next thing I remember was waking up in the middle of the night again in my bedroom and hearing a thumping sound kind of far away. It was like something thumping against the side of the house, something heavy falling against it. I got up and I turned the lights on and I kind of walked around to that side of the house near the kitchen. The sound did not repeat itself. I kept investigating, though. I went down into the cellar. I just have the first floor, the ground floor, and the cellar. And I opened the door to the cellar, and I heard the thumping again. It was still on the same side of the house, definitely. So I went down the cellar steps. I didn't bother to turn on the light overhead. It was dark. I thought maybe I could look out one of the basement windows and see something out there. But that sound stopped, and I looked around, and the only thing I noticed was on looked up at one of the basement windows, went over to it, and I saw 3 handprints. They were made just with hands pressing into the frost of the window. It was very cold out. 3 distinct handprints, all of 3 distinct sizes. A very large palm, a smaller one near that, and a very small one near that. And I don't know how long they would have had to have been there. I don't know, but I assumed it was very recent. I live, as I've said, very far out. No one should have been putting their palms on my window, if that's what it was. I thought to myself, are you sure you're seeing what you're seeing? I thought maybe it was coincidence, maybe just some kind of strange thing. I was not seeing what I thought I was, but I went back up the stairs and I laid awake for a while and finally fell asleep. A few days went by. There was a new thing starting where I would hear lots of police sirens in the distance, even though I would never see any police cars go down the road. Sometimes I would hear 4 or 5 police sirens a day, where it used to be one I would hear every 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something. I would try and stand on my lawn in the front and try to figure out where they're coming from. It always seemed so far away. I would walk down the street and look in both directions. My mail, by the way, still hadn't been picked up. It had been several days. And I would go back inside the house after hearing this, and I had started a sheet of paper. On it, I had a little chart. It had 2 columns on it, one for the date, and the other column heading said, Cars on Road. I've been keeping this log now for 4 days. I made a 0 in the right-hand column, and the numbers that I was making in the columns kept dropping. For instance, on the day I'm thinking of, not a single car had gone by on the road all day. It had dropped from 2 to 1 to nothing. I even walked down almost several hundred yards to make sure there was nothing blocking the road or some kind of accident, but there was nothing. I began to regret that I didn't really know my neighbors at all. I would have liked to have knocked on a door and asked them what was up, but I never did. I was looking into my refrigerator, very discouraged, because I had finally run out of groceries. And there is a small local grocery store about a mile down my road. This is where I'd planned to do all my shopping for about a year, just walking back and forth with whatever I needed. So I finally headed out, and I planned to walk all the way into town, which is a little over 4 miles. Straight shot down the road. I hook a right and go through a small community, and then I'm there. I started walking, and I walked past the grocery store where I usually shop, and it was shuttered and closed, but it was Sunday, so there was nothing too strange about that. So I kept walking, and there was just no sound at all. No cars went past. On the spur of the moment, I decided to knock on the door of the 2 people I actually did kind of know on the road. I had seen them at a function at the town library and met them and talked to them for a few minutes a couple of months before. They seemed a very nice younger couple. I knocked on their door. 2 cars were in the driveway, but they didn't come out. So I kept walking. And actually I stopped about 75 feet down their driveway. Some residual memory of having seen something in my peripheral vision. I turned around and I walked back up to Ellen and Sam's house. On the screened-in back porch, there was a green plastic table and 2 white plastic chairs, the kind you just buy from the grocery store. On top of the table there was a spiral notebook, open to about the middle, and I could see the handwriting on one of the exposed pages, though not well enough to make out any of the words. And a pencil was lying about a foot away from the chair in which the writer had once been sitting. The pencil had never been picked up for some reason. The screen door was locked. The curtains inside were drawn. I kept walking into town. I got there at about 1:30 in the afternoon. Now it's very small. It's just a single street called Main Street. There's just a few businesses. There's a cafe. There's a laundromat. There's a very ancient movie theater that's about to close. That's pretty much it, except for a couple of churches and a post office. Nothing much going on. Now on a Sunday, everything was mostly closed, but now there was just no sign of human life. Just none at all. And I thought that was impossible. Everything couldn't be closed. Usually the cafe was open. Usually there were a few people on the streets. There was no one. I stood at the head of Main Street just looking and standing and staring. At long last, 1 car rolled by, headed down Easted Street. A little too far away for me to see who was driving it, and driving quite slowly at that. I had no idea what was going on. All I did was just turn around and start to walk back home, not having gotten any food or anything. I didn't know what to do. I just kept walking down the deserted country road, past houses where there was no activity, no one on their lawns, no one getting into cars, going anywhere. I went back inside my house, and I sat and I thought. That night I was very restless, so I went down into the basement and I dug into my old steamer trunk. This is where I had buried a lot of my little electronic devices, as many as I could, and still be somewhat comfortable. Now my TV was gone, my computer was gone, but at the very bottom of the trunk I did have my little clock radio, and I pulled that back out. And I went upstairs and I plugged it in, and I turned it on and started looking for stations. Now, I couldn't get much of anything where I was, but I did hear a couple of the national feeds, the national stations still playing whatever they played. That was strangely comforting, but the more and more I went up and down the dial, the more it was obvious I couldn't find anything local anymore. It was just, everything was static. I couldn't remember if that was always the case, but I could have sworn I used to listen to baseball games many years before on the radio, and that was a local station, and that station seemed to be gone. I just left the radio play static for a long time. Before I went to bed, I flipped through it one more time, and I did come across something, and it was staticky, but it was very clear. There was the voice of just one man somewhere down, way down on the AM dial. And he was saying, that's what we just don't understand. That's what we just don't understand. He was saying that he was the only one left who knew how to keep the signal going out, and he was saying that he was going to stay on for a while, but he didn't know how long he was going to feel safe where he was. And then he said, for anyone who can hear this who might still be wondering what's happening, let me tell you what I know. And then he began to explain things. For a full 24 hours, I couldn't make a decision about what to do. All day, I mostly just sat and listened to the radio, trying to get that feedback, but it had disappeared. I looked out the window a lot, didn't see anything, nothing had changed. I knew I had to take some kind of action before it became dark, but I couldn't. I was just frozen in place. And the hours passed, and it became night, and I began to become afraid. I was just hoping that the radio signal would come back, just hoping. And I finally got moving at 11:30. That was 4 hours ago. Here's what happened. I left the house. It was very cold. I walked down the street, looking at all the houses. None of them had lights on. I walked about halfway down the road toward the grocery store and toward town. It took a while because I was going up to all the driveways and was looking inside each car. And the house, the little house that was just a few hundred yards shy of the grocery store, which now seemed to be permanently shut, I got lucky. There were keys in the ignition of the car. It was a little Nissan. So I got in the car, and I started it, and I pulled out, and I began to drive. I noticed quickly that I only had a little less than a quarter tank of gas to work with. I just drove down the road. I went through town, and I saw exactly what I was expecting to see, which was nothing, so I kept going. I drove about 4 more miles to the intersection of Bakerton Lane, which is actually a very long country road that leads to the highway, Route 57. Route 57 is 2 lanes going each direction. I got on there, and I drove. And I drove, and I was looking for a single set of headlights. And I didn't see one coming. I kept going and kept going, 12, 13 miles. I had my high beams on. There were some lights sometimes in some of the houses, but of human presence there didn't really seem to be any out in the world. I went by a couple of gas stations that were closed. And I finally came to I-81, a major interstate highway, and I got on it and I began to drive at about 65 miles per hour in the center lane, going north. Nobody came. I was the only one on the highway. I tried to turn on the radio, and of course I got nothing. At one point I did get a brief signal from a national radio station, but then it suddenly cut out. I'm not sure why, and the programming that had been playing was just music on a loop. There was no DJ or anything. It was like it was a recording or something. I don't know how long I drove, but I had to be very conscious of my gas level. So at some point I slowed the car in the middle of I-81 and I turned around. I turned around and I drove all the way back to the main street of my town. And I parked the car on the side of the road in front of the little Thai restaurant we have there. And I got out and I stood, looking around, kind of shivering in the cold, in the dark. I went down a couple of the side streets. Not sure why, I just didn't want to be in that car anymore. I walked through a little church cemetery that was beside the Presbyterian church. I started to go across the grounds of the junior military school. I just felt too uncomfortable. I felt too exposed, so I turned around and I stopped. It felt better to be near buildings of some kind. I got back to Main Street. I was ready to get back in the car. And I looked down the road, and about 3 blocks away, there was a stoplight, and standing on the sidewalk was the figure of a man. I couldn't make out any details. He was just standing there. Now, he obviously must have seen me. I was standing under a streetlight, and the fact that he did not move, that shape did not move, told me I should not approach it. So we just stood there, kind of looking at each other. I assume he was looking at me. I was not going to go near him. I decided the best thing to do was get back in the car right at that moment. So I turned my body toward it. It was only about 8 steps away, and when I turned, I saw in my peripheral vision on my right, well down Wellington Street, one of the side roads, someone was running at me. Someone was running right down the middle of the road, right at me, maybe 100 yards away, and this person was holding some kind of machete, some kind of knife high above his head. He was just running as fast as he could toward me. And the split second I caught sight of that motion, before I even really got a look at the knife or whatever it was he was holding, I bolted for the car. I got right in. I got in, I gunned the ignition, and I peeled out incredibly quickly. And I just floored it right down Main Street. And even though I went right past that figure in the shadows, that silhouette that was standing and looking at me, I did not look at it. I did not look at that person. I went right through the red light and kept going, back toward my house. I knew I had just enough gas to get there. And I was right. And now it's... the clock radio says it's 3:59. The car is sitting in the driveway. Pretty much useless to me now. I'm sitting in a chair in the middle of my basement as I record this, on my little mini cassette recorder that I've had for about 20 years, which I had to dig out from the bottom of my steamer trunk. I've kept it dark in the basement. It's the way I want it. And now I myself am holding a knife of my own, a steak knife from the kitchen. About 20 minutes ago, there was a knock at the door. I was sitting on my living room sofa. I didn't wait for it to repeat itself this time. I just got up and went over to the door, and I put my head against it, my forehead. I had long since started locking my door. And it was Sarah's voice outside, and she was asking again if I would let her in. She said, "Will you let me in now, Gary?" And I said, "No, Sarah, I won't. I can't." I didn't look out the window. Wouldn't do it. Couldn't do it. But Sarah said that they were all going to come in for me now. And she wasn't alone now. And this I could verify was true just by listening very closely. Outside I could sense that human presence, the shuffling of footsteps. I don't know how many were out there. So I asked her, how many? And she said, "Why don't you look out the window and see?" I wouldn't do that. Her voice was even more frail and slurred than it had been that other night. She was still Sarah, recognizably Sarah, but very different. She told me through the door that everyone else in town was like her now. Everyone except me. And I asked her what it felt like to be dead. And there was a long, long pause. I could just hear the wind outside. And Sarah said, in a voice that was so sad, "Oh, it's terrible. It's terrible."